and therefore, having served 1 day out of the 3 days, you can proceed to continue attending the sessions of this House. Proceed, Senator Eddy.
Mr. Speaker, I thank you, and I just want to be sure that I'm timing myself here, because it's a very important matter. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to matters of climate change, where we find ourselves today as a country, we definitely need to be more scientific, and definitely we need to also rely on data. Because when we review this particular bill, we must be able to look at the journey that we have traveled as a country to be part of this particular bill. And Mr. Speaker, I wanted to comment very fast that the essence of climate change and control of climate issues in our country cannot be without recognizing the fact that fossil fuels has been at the edge of why global warming issues have been a problem. In 1896, Mr. Speaker, a scientist called Sanate put a very compelling argument that burning fossil fuels was the major cause of climate change in global south and global north, Mr. Speaker. Nobody paid attention to him until in the 1930s, when other scientists joined this particular scientist, Mr. Speaker, to argue the case for northern US as well as the northern Pacific for what was becoming a major problem. And Mr. Speaker, at that time, there was another scientist a British scientist in Europe called Guy Stewart Callender, who was for the first time the first scientist to actually use data and science and mathematical models to argue the case for climate crisis, Mr. Speaker. But even then, he wasn't taken seriously, Mr. Speaker. It was up until 1988, Mr. Speaker, when a scientist called James Hansen, who was a NASA scientist, brought this issue to the UN that actually global warming due to fossil fuels was a major issue, that then the UN responded by forming the first inter-panel on climate change in the 1988, Mr. Speaker. Why am I giving this backdrop, Mr. Speaker? Because the Paris Agreement comes on that backdrop. In 1992, Mr. Speaker, we had the Rio Conference. And in that Rio Conference, Mr. Speaker, many countries that were developed that were causing serious climate problems, including the US at that time, did not participate in making sure that our countries could be compensated, Mr. Speaker. And the Paris Agreement, for which this particular bill comes, Mr. Speaker, that proposes a market mechanism, Mr. Speaker, is an agreement that seeks to enable us as countries to develop our own mechanisms internally, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, while I do support this particular bill, Mr. Speaker, I want to encourage the drafters of this bill to actually be able to think critically about the carbon markets, Mr. Speaker, to the extent that we can actually make it more practical to local communities. For instance, Mr. Speaker, if you look at section 23C, we are giving the Cabinet Secretary a full control of a carbon market which does not allow even the Cabinet Secretary to interact with Parliament to be able to ensure that we can be able to have reporting mechanisms to Parliament in accordance to Article